A couple of seasons ago, we had, was it the Dover Quartet here, and they brought with them your Pale Blue Dot. They just wanted to play it. We said, oh, good, we've never heard that. Let's have it. And it's not the usual, Haydn-esque tune and harmony thing. It uses the sounds of the instruments in a very interesting way. It has sort of a program behind it. If you imagine a space probe deep in the universe being discovered by some alien race, trying to figure out what it is, chattering about it, and eventually you start getting some garbled signals. And the audience loved it. We got one of the strongest ovations for a newish piece that we've ever had. And so on the board, we looked at each other and said, we got to ask this guy to write something for us. And the result you're going to hear tonight for the very first time, and you kind of for the first time, you've been in on the rehearsals, Spiral Galaxies. Now, between Pale Blue Dot and its space connotations and Spiral Galaxies, you mentioned this in great detail in your program notes. I get the feeling that you're inspired by science a lot in your composition, but do you use that more as a metaphor, or are you using, well, like some composers used to use algebra to come up with their tone sequences, or they'd cast the I Ching or something? Exactly how are you incorporating science into your music?
Thank you. Well, in Pale Blue Dot, you're absolutely right. There was a program. There were aliens. There were gigantic praying mantises chattering away. I watched way too much sci-fi as a kid. In this piece, you're absolutely right about that too. The spiral galaxy is more a metaphor for our lives. The idea of that we grow out in these rings and eventually into oblivion. But starting in a very kind of tight place, and as we experience more and accumulate knowledge and experience and people in our lives and loved ones, that the spirals grow. A lot of my music is inspired by astronomy or science, or I just wrote a piano concerto for Bravo Vale, not too far from here, called Pangea, which, but that's actually a reflection on climate change and extinction that we face now. So often there's some political or some sort of many-layered message to it. And for me, ideas from science and mathematics apply very well to music as long as they're applied musically. So even though I studied a lot of Schoenberg, for instance, Schoenberg himself never used much mathematics, never, it's the kind of followers, it's like a Marx effect. And so in this piece, I thought a lot about principles from science and outer space and so forth that would be true, that are true here on Earth, that would be true in the middle of a, maybe not in the middle of a black hole. Anyway, before I get ahead of myself, things like the overtone series, the golden mean, the Fibonacci sequence, but all these things are personal to me, and I don't feel like anyone here has to know anything about that to enjoy the piece. And I'm not even really interested in the kind of mathematics of it, but it helps me plan a piece out and create shapes, actually, spiraling shapes. That's what the Fibonacci sequence in math does.
I'm sorry, you mentioned the Marx effect, and we're talking about numbers. I'm thinking of the Marx Brothers exchange. For that, you can get 2 to 5 at Leavenworth. Me, I'll take 5 and 10 at Woolworth. You mentioned Schoenberg, and that leads me to another question. I was looking at your works list recently, and I noticed that you got one piece that's composed specifically for the ensemble Schoenberg used in Pierrot Lunaire, which is a non-standard ensemble, but it's more standard now because of that. You've done something else for the ensemble used in Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat. Are you on some sort of a mission? Are you going to be doing the Beethoven septet instrumentation, things like that? Why are you tackling that particular kind of instrumentation?
Well, in the case of the L'Histoire, that was a piece written for a tour group from the school where I teach, at Curtis, the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. So I teach composition there, and that year, it was 2009, I wrote a song cycle for the L'Histoire du Soldat, which is a piece Stravinsky wrote inspired by Dixieland bands. So trumpet, trombone, violin, bass, clarinet, bassoon, and percussion, which is a kind of strange ensemble, but it works very well, actually, to get certain very evocative sounds. I used the text of Omar Khayyam for that. And then we did a tour with that, and I narrated L'Histoire, which was really, really fun. I got to ham it up. The Pierrot Ensemble is actually a kind of standard new music ensemble now, and that's one of his contributions. So the piece I think you're mentioning I wrote for the group Eighth Blackbird, and I don't know if they've been here, but they're a phenomenal new music group. So the commission, you get a commission, and the things stipulated are what are the instruments and how long is the piece. And so that's part of being a composer, is taking on the challenge of writing for different media.
Well, we asked you specifically for a piano trio, and I gather this is your third effort in that form. If you're just writing for yourself, what instrumental combination comes most naturally to you to express what you want to express?
That's a very tough question, because I feel like it's the message that I'm interested in. The medium, whatever that medium is my vehicle to convey that message. And so I love writing for really any ensemble that's put in front of me. The piano trios, the first one is called Three Yiddish Dances, because I'm newish as well. Sorry, bad humor. Sorry. The second one is incidental music for Midsummer's Night Dream, which was written for the Kalkstein-Laredo-Robinson trio. And then this one is totally different too. So it's actually the same medium, but each one has a very, very different, conveys a very, very different message.
I want to talk a little bit about piano music for reasons that you will probably make clear in your answer. Does your uncle ever play your piano pieces? You might want to mention who your uncle is.
Sure, my uncle is Peter Serkin, and my grandfather was Rudolf Serkin, and it goes back before that. My great-grandfather was a wonderful violinist named Adolf Busch, and that goes back a few generations too. So Peter has played my music. I'm always very intimidated by that experience, but he's also my uncle, and wonderful. And we had a tour together this summer in Europe, and just had a great time. And I had to kind of watch over him a bit because he can be badly behaved, but it was really great.
I thought he outgrew that. When we look at bios of performers, we usually see a laundry list of people they studied with, and usually it's somebody they had a 1-hour master class with, but you can put this famous name in your CV. I think when you're a composer, when you're studying composition, the exposure is a little more intense, and you have kind of a diverse array of composers you studied with, and now you're teaching the next generation. But when we see the instrumentalist list another famous instrumentalist, you kind of think, well, maybe this pianist is trying to absorb something of the style or the technique of that particular pianist. Does it do that with composers? It seems like a composer who studied with Milton Babbitt can come away sounding nothing like Milton Babbitt. And for some people, that's a good thing.
Well, Babbitt's a great example because he was a composer who had a real orthodoxy in his language, but did not impose that. And of course, the best composition teachers, like I imagine the best creative writing teachers, want to help their students just be the best versions of themselves and not little versions of the teacher. That said, it's almost unavoidable for you to pick up, just as we pick up our parents' mannerisms and we hate it, right? That happens with our teachers. We pick up little things from them. Some students I've had, will be like actually rewriting pieces I've written, and I never say anything because I know that they'll find their own path eventually. And others completely do their own thing, but you almost, there's a kind of osmosis that happens in the process of teaching. And I'm definitely personally an amalgam of all of my teachers, and all of the other musical experiences I've had. But each one of them had a profound influence on me.
What about picking things up from your students? Do you do that? Can you do that? I know in other disciplines there's some controversy when someone's paper is based largely on a graduate student's work, but the graduate student doesn't get credited for the paper. So you have to worry about that a little bit. Do you pick up ideas from your students that you can use?
I probably do, but I would never tell them. And I think just in the transaction of creating music together, looking at music together, it happens. If I look at, a Stravinsky piece, something might sink in, or I look at a piece by Kaya Sariaho or something, it'll just, if it's something that catches my ear or eye, maybe it'll find its way into the music. So much of this is unconscious. I think that's been true throughout the history of making music and art. You just have to be very open to do this, and things will seep in.
You've been here in Tucson for some of the rehearsals. You've been working with the Morgenstern trio pretty closely. At what point do you set this music free? When do you stop fiddling with it, and when do you just sit back and think, okay, that's enough? It may not be exactly what I want it to be in the ideal world, but it's time to let it go.
It's a great question. I worked with the poet Galway Connell when I was in my early 20s. I was very fortunate. And remember reading, he said something about coming back to a poem 10 years later and deciding not to change it. That he felt like the clay was always wet on the sculpture, and he was always tempted, and often would, but sometimes decide, let this be. So for me, I think after a year or two passes on a piece, I'm reluctant to go back. Maybe I'll go back with a scalpel, but not a chainsaw. But before that, sure, I'll get the chainsaw out and the chisel and everything else.
Well, what about as late as today? Were you making significant changes today? Because we have had that happen a few times in the past.
Was anyone here for the rehearsal? Okay. I added a note. It was a D sharp. I added one note. I joked that maybe I'll add a movement, but they laughed. They were nice about it. I've gone so far as to cut out measures, change tempos, change all the time. And the reason for this, in the rehearsal I said, composers are playwrights and these are the actors. And sometimes making that transition into the three-dimensional performance space, things happen that you never expected in the, I think, 2 dimensions of your inner ear and your brain. So I write this music and I recreate it in my head and I sing through it, and maybe I'll play a little on the piano. But it's not until you have your actors actually giving their lines. That's the music, right? What I've written, the score, that's not the music. That's the map. That's how to play the music. But it's not the actual music. So what we hear tonight is the music, and this piece does not yet exist until they play it tonight. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things about a premiere for myself, or being any part of new music in the audience listening to any composer.
I want to ask you something a little geeky. Why D sharp rather than E flat?
Well, it was going to E.
Is there anything else you want to talk about tonight before you do away with me?
I have to say how impressed I am by the community here. I go to a lot of music festivals. I have lots of premieres. I'm very fortunate to be an active commissioned composer. This is my life task, as Adler would say, But I don't know of any festivals that have this kind of community, where the community is actually the blood of the festival, where the people in the audience are also so participatory in the commissioning, the running, looking in here, your pictures in here, all these folks who are involved in this place. And that to me it's unbelievable and a great, great inspiration. And I know they're celebrating big anniversaries right now, and I just want to say, keep doing what you're doing, because this is very, very unique what you have here in Tucson, and I'm in awe of it. Really, really proud and honored to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. David Ludwig.